Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Yapping with YUCCA podcast. My name is Zoe, and today we are sitting down with Armon and Jon, who are two incredible leaders who are organizing in regions on the front lines of extraction, industry expansion, and corporate control. And today we're going to really be diving into their work, the fights that are ahead at CERA Week in Houston later this month, and really talking about how we can continue to build power and solidarity across borders, movements, and generations. So with that, I was curious, can our YUCCA folks here in the room just go around and do some quick introductions, and then we'll pass things over to Armon and Jon?
Yeah, I'm Victoria. I'm YUCCA's organizing program coordinator. I've been here for about a year now as staff. Before that, I was part of steering committee. I can go ahead and pass it on to Zan.
I'm Zan Dixon, and I am a fellow with YUCCA, and I have also been here. Well, I've been here for about a year.
Hello, I'm Yaj. I am a policy fellow with YUCCA. I'm also on steering committee. I've been with YUCCA for about 2 or 3 years. Also do many other things as well as everybody else on this team and our millions of jobs.
Awesome. No, and I know I didn't mention I'm YUCCA's communications manager. I've been on board with YUCCA for about a year now. And like others in the room, I think we all rotate in and out of all these other responsibilities. But I want to pass things over to Jon and Armon. If y'all could just introduce yourselves and maybe tell us a little bit about the communities that you're from and some of the core issues you're organizing around right now.
Thanks, Zoe. Howdy, folks. My name is Armon Alex. I'm from the Gulf South here on Turtle Island, born and raised on the Texas coast, more specifically. I'm the son of a Mexican mother with indigenous Hopi lineage and a Black father who grounded me in our ties to the Black Panther Party ideals. So for me, land and water were never abstract. They were sacred. They were and are relational. My background is primarily in marine biology and science communications. I studied jellyfish, water quality, and ecosystems. But growing up next to refineries and the third largest port in the so-called United States, you realize very quickly that the science doesn't exist in a vacuum. And very easily, data becomes political. And right now, I primarily organize around petrochemical expansion, LNG exports, desalination, AI data centers, private equity, industrial water systems. Because in Corpus Christi, heavy industry, fossil fuel companies consume massive amounts of water, pollute our air, and then tell us it's all for economic development. And so my work sits at the intersection of eco-socialism, environmental justice, and community self-determination. I believe in people power, I believe in indigenous governance principles, and I believe the communities closest to the harm should always be the closest to the decision making. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Armon. Jon, go for it.
Hi, my name is Jon. I'm also from the Gulf South in the Houston area in Texas, where we see a lot of fossil fuel refinery build out. I currently live in the El Paso borderlands region near Las Cruces. My participation in activism comes from it started when my mother took me to the state capitol as a teenager to protest against education budget cuts, to later on going up to Standing Rock resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline, North Dakota back in 2016. I returned home back to Houston at the time with the mantra stuck in my head from the indigenous elders there saying, go home and organize your communities because Standing Rock is everywhere. So I collaborated with other folks in Houston to help organize some protests against Energy Transfer Partners outside their headquarters in our downtown district. We were recruiting folks from Houston to rideshare to Standing Rock to participate in the front line. But when they had to close down the camps at Standing Rock, we were then redirecting folks to West Texas to fight the Trans-Pecos pipeline that was also being constructed by Energy Transfer Partners. So the core issue I've been organizing around has been pipeline battles, and my focus is more around marketing and recruitment, networking, and just, getting folks to show up. It wasn't until the last few years that I went from being a person standing in solidarity for impacted communities to an actual impacted community member myself, as they've been building a pipeline corridor in the low income BIPOC town that I grew up in. And so that's when I realized what the elders at Standing Rock meant by Standing Rock is everywhere. Go home and organize your community. And these explosive pipelines going through Cleveland are routed towards refineries in Houston, to export terminals in the Gulf, kind of like what Armand's dealing with. And these pipelines endanger our school children, my family, and contaminating our communities with the methane releases near those compressor stations built along the pipeline route.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. This is Yaj. I'm not sure. I don't think you can see me right now, but yeah, thank you so much for that context and like what you come from, as well as you, Armand. Like this context is just so important to understanding who it's affecting and who are actually, participating in the good fight, and the people that are actually in community, and yeah, showing up for what is currently happening. And also, thank you for listening to Native elders. They're always right. But moving on, we've collaborated in the past through spaces like New York Climate Week. That's where I met both of you. We did the We Got Us boot camp and mass mobilization. And we'd like to ask from your perspective, what do these moments show about the movement, this work? What was brought up for you, and what was possible for our communities to organize together?
Yeah, gosh. Those, moments like those showed us that coordination changes scale. When Gulf Coast organizers, when New Mexico organizers, when Appalachia folks, so-called borderland communities, and global South advocates are in the same room, we all really start to see the full chain of harm. And we realized that we're not fighting separate fights because, the fracked gas in the Permian flows to LNG terminals, as John had mentioned, in my hometowns along the Gulf South coast. The oil refined on our coast fuels militarism abroad, and the same banks financing extraction also finance AI data centers, desal projects, and private equity. Those spaces showed us that when we align analysis and strategies, much like these terrible corporations do, they get nervous because they depend on us being siloed.
This is Zan, and yeah, no, I really like what you're saying about how there are all of these interconnected issues happening across regions that feel very isolated, especially for impacted communities. But all of these things really are connected, and we can really see that when we start organizing together. And I just like you to expand on or John, you can also jump in about like what feels like the through line, and like what feels like the connecting thing of all of our issues of extraction, and all of the different examples that you had just brought up.
Piggybacking off of what Armand said, I see when people come together in solidarity and organize together, it creates the right conditions to share our experiences regarding the issues that matter most to us. That gets folks talking, and it creates an environment where we can validate each other's feelings. In these spaces, I've heard conversations like, honey, don't you realize it's not normal to be attending that many funerals in 1 year because folks in your community are dying from cancer? And this is a common theme in the refinery dense area that I come from, as the fossil fuel industry has been left unchecked for so long that their impacts are still being studied to this day.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things that really struck me when we were all together in New York, right, especially doing that big, both for the Make Billionaires Pay March that I know folks were present for, and also the protest outside of Blackstone's headquarters in New York, was just how powerful it was to see, not only like from an outside perspective, all of our like communities coming together, but also in the ways that it, like, I think reinforced to all of us, right, that we are not alone in these fights, and that we are all really up against the same polluters and the same billionaires and the same corporations, right? And so totally agree with what you all were sharing around that piece. I think too, one thing that I'm curious about, I know that like when we were in New York, we talked a lot about how the oil that is flowing through pipelines in the Permian Basin here, right, and coming out of New Mexico, is then going on to continue to pollute communities in the Gulf South, and extending its harm also far beyond, right, these borders that we know shouldn't even exist, and far beyond the so-called United States as well. So I'm curious too, if we could just dive in a little bit in terms of what that full chain of harm actually looks like, because I know that New Mexico in a lot of ways is on one end of that, and other communities are on another. So curious if y'all have thoughts you want to share around that and what that chain of harm looks like.
Yeah, I can jump in here. And I know that it's really easy to get caught up in like the super, small details of it all. But I do want to make sure that it's palatable for folks tuning in. So for me, the best way to kind of summarize this is that when oil is fracked in the Permian Basin, communities in New Mexico and West Texas deal with earthquakes, methane leaks, poisoned groundwater. That oil and gas then moves through pipelines that are often through indigenous land. And it goes to the Gulf Coast refineries in my backyard, and even export terminals there too. There we find Black and Brown communities who are nestled with the impacts of pollution, breathing in the emissions, then is exported overseas. Yes, our energy is going straight overseas, where the combustion contributes to climate collapse, to biodiversity loss, all that disproportionately impacts the global south. And so it's important for all of us to understand that this system is not by any chance an accident. It is incredibly intentionally designed that.
It also looks like families who have been guaranteed the right to private property through the U.S. Constitution to having that right violated through eminent domain. And it's quite interesting how a colonial government that, has a history of violating native treaties for centuries is now steeping so low that it violates its own treaty with its own people, as this seizure of land causes families to be displaced and communities divided, because some people are eager to take the money when the industry is offering pennies on the dollar for the land. Others are concerned about their family's safety and the future of their children, and asking the question, how could you take this money when it's endangering our local elementary school? And, this causes frictions in communities where it's like, well, our family, we can barely afford groceries, or, it looks like homes and cars being melted from pipeline fires that take days to extinguish, like the one that happened in the LaPorte area not too long ago, which is also in the area of Houston. And like I said before, people dying from cancer due to the volatile organic compounds emitted when pipelines need to release gas into the air in order to regulate that pressure at the compressor stations that keep the pipeline gas flowing. And all of this is for money. There's a reason why Kelsey Warren, the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, is friends with Donald Trump and friends with Texas Governor Abbott. There's a reason why Kelsey Warren had a net worth of $1.7 billion 10 years ago before the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock to now having a net worth of $7.9 billion. And so right now, there's actually a pipeline in the permitting process by Energy Transfer, which appears to be intended to transport gas from the Permian to the Project Jupiter data center in Doña Ana County. And as someone who currently lives like not far from where they're building that data center, I like to open my windows instead of running the AC. I like clean air. I like clean water, drinking water, access to drinking water, and this data center is putting all of that in jeopardy. But these pipelines are what connects us all. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, analysis, basically. Like, we really want our audience to, understand all these connections and that it is complex and hard to hear sometimes, but knowing that there are people like y'all that know who is impacted, again, like that is, essential. And I'm kind of wondering, like, speaking on this idea that we know we're all connected by different struggles, by our communities, geographically, and thinking about, even hearing what you're saying, I think about my own experience getting into this kind of work. And before that, my understanding was very limited and definitely had the idea the idea that like these struggles were separate. So I'm wondering like what happens when we start to think about these struggles as one, and on a personal level and a community level doing this kind of work, how is this important to the work and kind of having a different analysis of that? Like you said, from like the oil pipelines to refinement to export and beyond that, like what about the forces that drive it, keep us separate from each other?
We are able to discover new forces to fight it by comparing notes with others in the same systemic issues, but in different parts of the country with different projects that are all connected.
Yeah, John, I appreciate you so much, especially with the thoughts that you had to offer to the previous. And Yaj, I feel you. Kudos to the endless learning that we are to pursue as we continue to age. Learning is all the time, and it's something that I hope all of us embrace all the time. And for me, question, I think like when we stop looking at one project in isolation, this illusion of just a local issue really does fall apart. If you look at a single refinery expansion, or like here in Corpus Christi, Texas, a desalination plant or a pipeline segment by itself, it can be often framed as just something that's technical, just something that's economic, necessary, even inevitable for a particular region. The language often becomes about, permits and jobs, engineering specifications. But in reality, when you zoom out and you get to trace the entire system from extraction in the Permian or Appalachia to pipelines cutting through indigenous land, to refineries on the Gulf Coast, to export terminals shipping LNG overseas, to import terminals over in Europe, you stop seeing just projects. You start to see full architecture. You see how capital flows. You see how banks finance multiple points in the chain, you see how regulatory agencies bend in similar ways across states. And you see how the same corporations sit on multiple ends of the supply line. And most importantly, you really start to see who consistently absorbs the harm. Black communities near refineries, indigenous communities near extraction sites, so-called border communities along transport corridors, working class neighborhoods downstream from petrochemical plants. And honestly, from a scientific perspective, systems thinking changes the questions that we ask. Systems thinking changes the questions that we ask. Instead of asking, is this one facility compliant, we ask, what is the cumulative impact on this entire corridor of extraction? Instead of actually asking, does this plant meet standards, we ask, who sets the standards and who benefits from that setting? And from a political perspective, this changes power. When we analyze the full system, we stop fighting one permit at a time and challenging the logic that drives all of them. Profit over people, growth without limits. I mean, we know it's extraction without accountability and so on and so on. And that's when movements, in my opinion, mature. Because once you see the system, you can coordinate more effectively against it. And once communities across regions recognize that they are all linked, that we are all linked upstream, downstream, globally, I feel like solidarity stops feeling symbolic, and I feel like it feels more, it can become strategic. And I think that helps shift everything.
Yeah, no, totally. I really appreciate that perspective because I think that's something we have seen over and over again, right? Is that no matter like what state lines we cross, right, the same groups of folks are the ones bearing the impacts of extraction and extractive and harmful systems, right? That the folks who are profiting off of these systems will never, ever experience and have a complete disregard for, right, the lived experiences and day-to-day struggles that our communities are facing. I think Jon, what you were saying around Project Jupiter was making me think about how that is a really good example of how all of these systems are really interconnected that folks here in New Mexico might be a little bit more familiar with in terms of the fact that not only is this massive AI data center being built out in the middle of the desert, right? But simultaneously, we are also fighting back against a private equity takeover of one of our largest utility companies. And we've seen across the country, right, how in the past these kinds of takeovers have actually allowed data center expansion and these kinds of extractive industry projects to continue without oversight and without accountability. And thinking about as well how that area of our state is also already incredibly polluted and up against the impacts of continued extraction and how this is going to, continue to worsen those issues. So was just grateful that was brought into the conversation as well. Yeah.
I know. I really appreciate what you were saying, Armon, about like scoping out or like zooming out and really looking at what is affecting us from like a very systemic view and seeing how like the full system operates and really how it is constructed and how when you see how all of its like effects and its like harm and how when we see how the harm is interconnected, it's really hard to not think it isn't like that. It isn't architect or like created and manifested through like extreme planning, and that it was something that is really just in the needs and in the name of profit and in control. And I really wanted to ask, when we trace that full system, what does it reveal about whose lives are considered expendable in the name of profits and control?
It reveals that people of color and people of low income are considered to be acceptable collateral damage in the eyes of those investors who are profiting, who are willing to create sacrifice zones just so those filthy rich people can get more returns on their investments. It also reveals that there are people in our own communities who would sell out to the industry, whether that be landowners willing to sell their lands to pipeline companies, or, there's been cases where even nonprofit organizations are pushing an agenda driven by their funders, which also helps investors get return on their investments because sometimes the same people who are investing in stuff, they're writing things off on their taxes with nonprofits and pushing them to fulfill this similar agenda. So it creates some blurred lines in our organizing work. It's just part of the system. I
Yeah.
think Armand's got, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's John, and that's the tea, honestly. I feel like there could be an entire episode specifically on NGOs and the nonprofit industrial complex and how nuanced and complex it is, even with like youth organizers. But back to Zan's question, like in my opinion, when we trace the full system, and from my experience, whether that's from drilling to pipeline to refinery to export terminal to global combustion, it has revealed something uncomfortable, but that is incredibly undeniable. That harm is not randomly distributed. It concentrates. It concentrates in Black neighborhoods along the Gulf Coast. It concentrates in indigenous lands in the Permian and Appalachia. It concentrates in migrant communities along transport corridors. It even concentrates in working class towns where tax bases are super thin and political leverage is incredibly limited. That pattern, it tells us something. It tells us that within this economic model, some lives are treated as buffers. Take a nod to racial capitalism, but that's a whole other episode, as an acceptable risk, as collateral damage, as sacrifice zones in the name of national interests or energy security. And so when refineries flare and asthma rates climb, it's not CEOs who are hospitalized. And when aquifers are contaminated, it's not the shareholders who have to ration bottled water. And in the Gulf South, when hurricanes intensify because of warming waters, it's not fossil fuel executives who have to rebuild with the assistance of FEMA. So when we chase the system honestly, we see that it relies incredibly on racialized geography. It relies on historical segregation. It relies on racism. It relies on communities that were redlined, under-resourced, and politically marginalized. And from my experience as a Black and Mexican Gulf Coast kid raised in refinery country, that's not abstract. It is very much lived experience. But here's like the deeper layer. It also reveals that the system depends on us not connecting these dots. It depends on Appalachia not seeing the Gulf Coast. It depends on the Gulf not seeing the global South. It depends on us thinking our suffering is isolated instead of, as I mentioned before, intentional and engineered. And you can't help but once you see the pattern, this like myth of neutrality disappears. Because then the question becomes, if a system consistently treats certain communities as expendable, Is that a flaw or is it the business model? And I think that's where environmental justice meets this sense of political clarity. And that's where, for all of us, for all of our regions, solidarity becomes non negotiable.
No, thank you so much for that. I am hearing time and time again and seeing out when we're doing the work, when we're watching the news, when we're just living our life, how BIPOC people are disproportionately affected and just treated as, yeah, like you were saying, just basically dirt on the bottom of people's shoe, if that, right? And I think one of the things that I also would like to highlight is how you were talking about how they're keeping us so separated, right? And they're trying to purposefully keep everyone so polarized that it is so hard for us to be able to see what everybody is going through and the different struggles that they are innately causing and know that they're causing. And I think that's just making me think about how earlier you were saying these systems, they're working exactly as designed, rather than these systems are failing our communities. And so I think I was just wondering if you guys would be able to dive a little bit more into how you were able to develop that analysis and the experiences that you had, what you were able to see. And yeah.
It comes from years of organizing, and years of having to be to remove that illusion that um, that this system is too big to fail, because it can fail and it will, because this is not sustainable. Um, I kind of brought up two systems actually. There's one system that is working exactly as it's designed to do, where the industry with big money buys out community members who accept pennies on the dollar for their land, so the industry can turn it into a sacrifice zone as the wealthy folks use their money to exploit lower income folks even more. We have to remember that these folks are low income for a reason, because while our country has the resources to help folks have more financial stability instead of funding things like Israel and war, it also means that people who are desperate to pay bills or groceries are easier to manipulate with short-term payments, even though these low-income folks are unaware that this is going to be a bad deal in the long term. But there is, however, another system that is failing our communities, and Armand said it best. We could have a whole hour-long podcast about that, but that's the nonprofit industrial complex, which is where NGOs who lack leadership from our impacted communities are only held accountable by their funders, who again are some of the same investors on these projects on Wall Street, rather than being held accountable by communities they claim to serve. That makes it easier for the industries that are already damaging our communities to come in and offer money to the nonprofit that's supposed to be defending our community from the big industry. And it's really failing us by having what's called controlled dissent. For perspective, big industries can buy out community members in a different way than offering fat checks for their land, but instead by becoming a donor of a foundation who then grants money to these nonprofit organizations, but with string attachments, where if the organization doesn't have strong boundaries with their funders, the funders can dictate the agenda of the nonprofit organization, who then accepts the grant and gives the community yet another illusion that they're present to stop the big industries when clearly they're industrialized themselves. So I would say that this is a failure in the system.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny. You mentioned Israel, and suddenly there's a bunch of pigeons outside my window right now. So, but no, thank goodness for elders. Thank goodness for the mentors in our communities that have the patience. And thank goodness that I grew up in a household that really emphasize the importance of respect and patience with our elders and other generations and other views outside of just immediately our families. And it's because of them and the years of organizing and working on different projects that, I've really come to realize that these systems aren't just failing our community, but they're working exactly as designed. It was it was built to extract. It was built to displace. It was built to concentrate wealth. And when Hillcrest, a historically Black neighborhood here in my hometown of so-called Corpus Christi, is targeted for industrial siting, when Appalachian mountains are blown apart, literally blown apart. And what just the concept of blowing up a mountain, I feel the pain within my heart of knowing what we are doing to our ancestors. When border communities are criminalized, that's not by any means like malfunction. That's the logic of racial capitalism. The Black Panther Party understood this. They didn't just call for reform, they called for community control of our land, housing, and our food and health. And we're in that lineage, and those ideologies are incredibly within our reach.
Yeah, no, thank you both so much for that. I think, yeah, in thinking about the ways that these systems are continuing to be perpetuated, right? And some of the actors that are playing a huge role in that, and like you all are saying, roles that span across every piece of this extractive system, right? We see that CEOs of one corporation are board members of another that is on the other end of this pipeline. We see, all of these ways that folks in industry and corporations, and like folks are mentioning in, NGO and nonprofit spaces too, are intertwined. I think one of the things I wanted to move us to is talking a little bit how we are working together to disrupt some of that, perpetuation of this system, and talking a little bit about the spaces where these folks convene and gather together to really scheme about the next ways that they're going to continue to extract resources and profits from our communities. And so I know that YUCCA is actually going to be traveling to Houston later this month in March to join you all and many others on the ground during CERA week. So I was curious, for folks who maybe haven't heard about CERA week at all before, maybe don't have a great sense of what that consists of, can y'all kind of break that down for folks in terms of what happens that week, and why folks are showing up in opposition as well?
CERA Week is like the Super Bowl of oil and gas executives. They've been having this conference since I was a little boy. It's a cesspool of CEOs and executives, planning to harm our communities even more, but not just in the Houston area, but globally. But we have turned it into something beautiful. Um, Sarah Week is now a week where old activists come and meet new ones, or younger ones, and where some of the communities from the earliest cases of environmental injustice come and meet new cases, such as communities facing the new threats of extractivism in their backyard who've never dealt with this before. We all come together and we march to the conference where those filthy rich CEOs and other representatives of these extractive industries meet and again make those plans to contaminate our communities furthermore. And it's interesting, they also are abusive towards workers that benefit from these so-called jobs that they create. So we also aim to build more worker solidarity there. And from outside the conference, we come together and we send a clear message to those filthy rich people that we see them and that we too are also conspiring to stop the environmental harm, even if it means hurting their wallets.
Yeah, so it's really exciting in the space of creating Sarah Week for something that is for the people and a space where we get to conspire and share notes. So for Sarah Week, or what we've rebranded as Confronting Sarah Week, hashtag Confronting Sarah Week. This is the main event is a 3-day gathering from Saturday, March 21st to Monday, March 23rd. Our first day is a community event from 11 to 3 p.m. Central at Mason Park in Houston, Texas. This is a family friendly day with music, and there will be artists and activities and community leaders all trying to connect with local organizations. And so that's day one, our community event. Day two, one of my favorites, is the workshops and trainings day. So this is Sunday, March 22nd, 12 to 6 p.m. Central. It's going to be located at First Universalist Unitarian Church in Houston, Texas. And the idea for this day is workshops and trainings to learn more about, I would say, like regional issues, develop some skills, political education, and to prepare for the mass march, which happens the next day, which is my absolute favorite. Honestly, all these days are my favorite, just to be honest. But the third and final day is March 23rd at 11 Central. We're going to start at the Houston City Hall, and we're going to have a peaceful march from Houston City Hall all the way over to the Sarah Wake Conference around the Discovery Green Park location. And for me, really quickly, like Sarah Week is, as John mentioned, where fossil fuel CEOs, I would also importantly, and also include in here, financiers and government officials, whether that's state officials in New Mexico, state officials in Texas, or even at the White House in this current administration, yuck. They all gather to coordinate the next decade of extraction under this language of like innovation. They talk about AI, they talk about hydrogen, they talk about an energy transition. But what they're really discussing is how to maintain control while appearing to be like forward looking or visionary or something like that. And so those narratives trickle down into real policy. They shape contracts, they justify LNG permits, they normalize data centers that drain aquifers, right? And so our communities are not invited to those into those rooms. And so we've built a space of our own.
Nice. Thank you for that, Armon. You've kind of answered part of that question that we have next. But I'm wanting to talk a little bit about the narratives that are being talked about at Sarah Week by these executives and, our current bad guys. Can you talk more about like the specifics of how they're using these narratives? And you kind of talked about like, it's for power. So like what power do they have because of these narratives and the people they associate themselves with? And also, if like policy decisions, that's obviously how big long-term changes get made by people in power. And that's more of on the more public front, but we know that a lot of these people are actually hidden from the public. So if you can make that connection, that'd be great for our viewers.
Well, speaking to the narratives that they come out of that conference with is one word, it's greenwashing. Another term to use is false solutions that you guys use a lot in New Mexico. Picture this. The industry proposes a new plan to harm our community by 150%. And then after we react to that plan, they come up with a false solution to deduct 50% of that harm to lower the impact to about 100%. Call it what you want, but 100% of harm is still 100%. And no job, no tax revenue is worth that harm. A prime example of this scenario would be carbon capture, where the industry says we're going to create jobs that pollute. But instead of polluting the air, we're going to use the ground and inject the pollution underground using pipelines, old pipelines that we're going to renovate, where the contamination is out of sight and out of mind. You don't see a big plume in the air anymore. But they don't disclose the fact that this can impact our drinking water and poison our air during pipeline leaks when they use those old pipelines that they're, excuse me, but half-ass renovating.
Yeah. Folks, spaces like CERA Week are narrative factories. They're not just conferences, okay? Like they're not just getting together and talking and sharing drinks and that's it. Like, no, it is very much intentional. They send their PR people, their comms people, their strategists, their rehearsal rooms for the next decade, as I've mentioned, of policy. The dominant narrative you hear there is this: energy expansion equals innovation. Innovation equals progress, and progress equals national strength. It's sleek, it's technocratic, it's full of phrases like AI driven efficiency, low carbon LNG, responsible development, private partnership, or public private partnership, essentially private partnership. What's missing in those narratives is who bears the cost. They frame LNG expansion as energy security, even though we're exporting all of it. Ask anyone that lives in the Gulf South. Not as they frame it as energy security, not as methane leakage in extraction zones or asthma in refinery communities. They frame desalination here in Corpus Christi as an example as water resilience, not as brine discharge into fragile bays or public subsidy for industrial growth. They frame AI data centers as economic modernization, not as massive electricity and water demands that intensify extraction upstream. And from my background, my scientific background, I pay attention to what's being measured and what's being omitted. They measure output, they measure market share, they measure investment flows, and they rarely measure cumulative community harm. They rarely measure long-term public health impacts. They rarely measure social costs of locking infrastructure in place for 40 years. And what we've seen is that those kind of narratives continue to trickle down because when CEOs gather in Houston and call something necessary for the energy transition, regulators hear that language. Regulators hear that language. Legislators adopt it. City councils, like in Corpus Christi, repeat it, and bond markets price it in. By the time it reaches our communities, it sounds like inevitability. Well, this is just the future. Well, we have to stay competitive. Well, industry needs certainty. What's happening is ideological conditioning. Innovation becomes this like shield against critique, any critique. Progress becomes synonymous with growth, and growth becomes unquestionable. But as someone raised between African spirituality, cosmology, and also indigenous practices, I reject this linear idea of progress. Progress is not more extraction with better branding. Progress is healthier communities. It's restored ecosystems and investments in supporting biodiversity. It's democratic control over our resources. And in my final thoughts on this question, because my goodness, you opened up Pandora's box, but if innovation doesn't reduce harm and redistribute power, it's not innovation. It's optimization of exploitation. So the real question isn't whether these projects are innovative, it's who gets to define progress. And in rooms like CERA Week, that definition is being written by people whose water is never at risk. That's why we show up outside those rooms. That's why we've reclaimed CERA Week. That's why folks in New Mexico and the Gulf South are gathering together to confront CERA Week, to contest the story, the narratives before it hardens into policy.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I'll say, just like a little side note, this is reminding me of a political cartoon I saw recently, and we can totally cut this out if it's like, I don't know, someone controversial that drew this, but it was basically like an some sort of extraction factory, refinement factory in the drawing, and then two people talking, and one of them was like, "Don't worry, like." By the time like they amend the bill, our town will be too small to vote on it anyways because it's all killing us. And it was like, oh, ha ha ha.
Could we find that cartoon and show the viewers?
Right, like I'll try and find it for this, but it was just like, damn, like it can be that simple, but like how you said, like the intention of all these narratives is to actually distract us and like. So we're not looking at everything that is affecting us and making those connections. But yeah, I'll pass it on to Zane.
No, yeah, I really appreciate like what you're saying about how like really speaking on how narratives are created and how they affect decision making, and they really like manufacture the language that is used to oppress our communities, and how they're used to like allow and like brainwash people into just thinking that it is okay to just sacrifice people to innovate and to go on to quote unquote progress. Just that entire thing. And especially with CERA Week, we see that like you were saying, that these boards are filled with like wealthy CEOs, people in industry, people who make a living in their entire lives off of just extraction, and they are the only people who essentially have decisions on our land, air, water, and our futures, as well as our future generations and our offsprings. And I'd just like to ask, what does it say when those decisions are being made by these people, and that our communities are never invited to bring upon their ideas or their opinions and have the right to self-determination?
Well, what it says about decisions about our land, our air, water, future, to answer that question, it's the same answer I have to nonprofit organizations who try to gatekeep and advocate for communities without actually getting involved with our communities or listen to our impacted communities. And that answer is, what it says is, your voice doesn't actually matter to us. You're just here to extract resources from our community so you can make profit. That's what it says.
Yeah. So next episode, youth in the nonprofit industrial complex. There's so much to unpack there. Yes. But Zan, I'm so glad that this is a question that you asked more specifically, because gosh, when those kind of decisions are being made about our land, our air, our water, our futures, when they're being made in rooms that are filled only with wealthy CEOs and industry insiders, rooms that our communities have never been invited to, it says something really clear to us that you can't deny. It says that the people most impacted are not considered as decision makers, but just variables. Like, let's be honest, those rooms are also not neutral policy spaces either. They're spaces dedicated to having to figure out capital coordination. They are rooms where investment strategies are aligned, risk is calculated, and narratives are crafted before they ever reach public hearings. When you exclude frontline communities from those spaces, you're not just leaving out our voices, they're reinforcing a hierarchy, a hierarchy that is completely so opposite that of indigenous teachings, a hierarchy that says investors first, industry second, our communities at the very last. And as someone raised in a Black household influenced by liberation movements, I was taught very concretely that power concedes nothing without demand. And as someone raised within indigenous practices, I was taught that decisions about land have to involve those that are in relationship to it. Anything else is a violation of such. So when rooms of corporate power claim authority over water systems, oh my gosh, even just saying this out loud makes me want to throw up. When they claim authority over water systems, pipelines, and energy futures without the people whose bodies will absorb those consequences, that pollution, it reveals that the system is structured around ownership, not stewardship. It reveals that access to decision making is determined by capital, not at all care. And scientifically speaking, that's so dangerous because systems designed without feedback from the most impacted communities are incredibly unstable. They produce blind spots. They externalize costs. They fail ethically way before they fail technically. And those rooms only function as exclusive spaces if we accept their legitimacy as the only arena where decisions are made. Historically, we know, Zan, you know this, transformative change has never started in elite conference halls. It has started in our churches. It has started in our community centers. It has started in our houses, in our union halls, in our kitchens, and street corners. It has started where people organize themselves, y'all. So what does it say? It says that the fight is not just about one project or even just one conference. It's about who governs the future. And if our communities aren't invited into those rooms, then we build our own rooms and we build power strong enough that they can't ignore us. Because land, air, water are not commodities. Sorry to the capitalists, but they're not commodities to be negotiated behind closed doors. Our ancestors teach us they are collective inheritances. And that means collective governance.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you also bringing in, understanding of power into this conversation, especially having to do with, power really being the ability to not only define what's going on, but be able to make decisions on what's going on, and bringing up, like how we have to know what we want to do next. And, I really appreciate you, bringing that up, and also about how we need to organize in our communities, especially in, spaces where affected community are at, which is at, community centers, in our churches, in our schools. Just on that, note, I'd like to ask, like, what are the messages that frontline communities, want decision makers and industry insiders to hear right now? What is y'all's way of defining what's going on?
To the decision makers, we will be holding y'all accountable for your actions because you people have gotten in bed with the industry and created an illusion that there's a process for us to follow to have a seat at the table when it comes to decisions. But we are well aware that the decision makers are more afraid of lawsuits from the big money industry and less afraid of organized communities, thus making the whole public participation process one big dog and pony show. To the industry leaders, the industry insiders, when y'all have poisoned the land, you won't have workers anymore. Workers enslaved to your paychecks. You won't have that anymore. You won't have water to drink or clean air to breathe. Let's take the wildfires in Hollywood and the floods in New York. That showed us that it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor, that nobody is immune to the effects of climate change. And, climate change is just Mother Earth's way of taking care of the problem because right now humans are the problem.
Really quickly, what message? Gosh, we're not expendable. Our water is not your subsidy. Our air is not your sacrifice zone. Our labor is not disposable. If you claim to innovate toward justice. If you claim to lead by divesting from harm. And understand, we are studying you as closely as you are studying us.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. No, thank you for that so much. I think that that's just also making me think of a lot of the different points of intervention and bringing it back to CERA Week and how we're going to be able to bring a contingent of folks from New Mexico up there. And we know that there's going to be a lot of other individuals as well as some different orgs joining up there as well. And so I think one of the things that I'm wondering is how folks can plug into the work around CERA Week, whether they are local to the Houston area or not.
Yeah, folks can plug into the work through a variety of ways, whether they be local to Houston or not. Some general ways to plug in, both local and remote. You can support the efforts from anywhere by RSVPing to attend. Confirm your plan to attend the 3-day event in Houston, and I'll go ahead and send y'all some links. Our RSVP page. You can join the next hype call. I think this is our last and final hype call where you get connected to the latest updates and meet other participants. The next one is scheduled for Thursday, March 5th, 2026 at 6 p.m. Central Time. That's another link that I owe y'all. Um, you can also amplify the event on social media by sharing the promotional posts and the captions. And so I can send over a social media toolkit with Instagram carousel and Facebook event page. You can share on your stories or share on Facebook. You can also sign up to volunteer your time to help us ensure that the event runs smoothly and safely. And we need all the help that we can get. Um, and if you need help with travel and lodging to attend the event in Houston, there is a form.
Yeah, a quick edit note for the travel form, uh, the support and lodging support, right? That is due on March 5th by end of day. Yeah,
Period.
for me, as it relates to your question, how can folks plug in? But like, okay, so like maybe the idea of like, how does this matter to me? If corporations are coordinating across these supply chains, then we have to coordinate across movements. The climate crisis, shout out to YUCCA, the climate crisis intersects with migration because climate displacement is incredibly real and it's happening in real time. It intersects with labor because refinery workers, they too deserve safe conditions and union protections, which they don't have. It intersects with criminalization because surveillance technologies used on migrants are powered by fossil fuel data centers and AI. Isolation only, folks, get this tattooed. Isolation only benefits corporations. Solidarity between our regions and our communities builds leverage. When young people and elders are aligned, like urgency meets wisdom. Oh, that's such a beautiful thing. That is dangerous to systems of control.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Again, we're so excited to be going out there for this event and connecting with, like you said, basically movement elders in this arena, which is so special and something that we should be striving for as people get activated and often and hopefully radicalized, and understanding these connections. Beyond CERA Week, what are some ways that you've seen successful community building? Or I guess like another way I can ask that is like, what are some tools or ways that you've seen meaningful building and lasting solidarity across movements? Our viewers we're hoping are people that are new to this kind of work and these environments. So if you can talk a little bit about how people can activate themselves and be in community in meaningful ways.
I would say communication is important. Coming with the with an intent to listen and not an intent to speak. Um, we live in bubbles, and anytime that someone makes one of these colonizer man-made borders, that's creating yet another bubble. What I'm learning in the borderlands, which is the cultural region between Las Cruces, Ciudad Juarez, and El Paso, Texas. In case you guys don't know, Ciudad Juarez is in Old Mexico. But in this region, it's like a tri-border, bi-state, bi-national region. And what we've learned here is what really divides us is communication, is language. And once we break through that barrier, that communication barrier, we realize that our struggle is a shared one. We also learn new strategies on how to organize from each other. Like, for example, because of the history of violence and abductions towards activists in Old Mexico, Mexicans have a more profound security culture that Americans could learn from. But deep down, the root of our strategies comes from a shared long history of organizing against colonization, against extractivism, and against white supremacy. So I would say focus on communication. If you're going to come to a new community, come with the intent to listen, especially to impacted community members, not with the intention to speak or create your own soapbox.
Yeah. Another thing I heard you say is like, I guess the intent for learning and like being open to learning and also knowing that, we might not know everything about a new community. So being open to the ways that we can learn about each other is really great. I'm also wondering like about, either like if either of you can answer this question of like, what are, as people get, like I said, like get activated in these spaces and get used to doing movement work, how can they like sustain that past just one protest or just like 1 week of their life where they like have learned about this thing and don't know how to, or might not even feel like they have the power to do anything about what they think is important.
Yeah. Ooh, Yaj. I think sometimes I like go to bed contemplating these things because like as young organizers, like we meet so many people our age that like they're also curious about the same thing. Like they feel incredibly overwhelmed. Maybe we can talk about that later. But you know, lasting solidarity, as an example, doesn't come from one King's Day march or whatever they call it, or 1 week, or one just viral moment. No disrespect. It comes from infrastructure. Corporations don't coordinate through vibes. I mean, like they do it through unfortunately. They do it through contracts, right? They shared investment strategies, board seats, long-term planning. If we want solidarity that lasts, we have to be more intentional about the way that we do it. And in my opinion, okay, first, we build shared analysis. If organizers in New Mexico understand how gas flows to the Gulf Coast, to Appalachia, or to the borderlands, then solidarity stops just being symbolic. It becomes incredibly strategic. We're not just supporting each other, we're disrupting the same system from different pressure points, right? Second, we have to build relationships, not just transactional. Not, I'll repost your flyer if you repost mine. Okay, yes, that helps, but like, come on. I mean, shared political education, we have to be doing those things, visiting each other's communities, breaking bread together, grieving together, celebrating together. As someone raised in Indigenous practices, I've learned that relationship is also governance. If you're not in relationship, you're not accountable. Jon mentioned this to me as well whenever I last visited Albuquerque with y'all. Third, we have to coordinate targets and timelines. One protest can be a spark, but what changes policy is, as Jon mentioned earlier, sustained pressure. That means agreeing on priority fights, aligning our messaging calendars, and supporting each other when retaliation comes. Solidarity, as Angela Davis mentions, is tested in crisis. And fourth, we invest in intergenerational leadership. The Black Panther Party didn't just protest, they built survival programs, as everyone knows these days. They built institutions. They understood that power is maintained through community care. If us as young organizers are always starting from scratch, we lose memory. We lose the wisdom of our ancestors. We lose the wisdom of our elders. And also, if elders are isolated from emerging movements, we also lose that momentum, as Jon mentioned earlier. And we really need both. I would say, like, the last thing, we tell the truth about the system. Climate justice, migration, labor rights, criminalization. We have to be factual in saying that these are not separate issues. That has to be foundation. They are outcomes of the same extractive logic. When we name that clearly, often reiterate it, we stop fragmenting ourselves. Lasting solidarity is not just this emotional alignment, it's also structural alignment. It's knowing that when one region is attacked, all of us respond. It's having shared values, shared strategy, shared accountability. It's moving like an ecosystem that is diverse, interconnected, and resilient. And so if corporations can coordinate across continents for profits, I'm pretty sure we can coordinate across so-called borders for liberation.
And I think that how we can build meaningful, lasting solidarity, again, showing up, listening to local struggles, amplifying those local struggles. We went over that already. Also offering advice or assistance with capacity, but without falling into the counterproductive role of being the savior. That's very important.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I think, I don't know, I was looking around our room here in person, and I think a lot of what y'all were mentioning around, how do we be in relationship to each other, right? In a way that is consistent, in a way that is supportive versus transaction, right? And transactional relationships that produce these kinds of like one-off protests sometimes, right? And like days of action where we have thousands of people in the streets, but when it comes down to it, who do we really know who we're in the streets with? Do we know who we share values with and where we are organizing from different perspectives? And I think that's one of the things I'm just really appreciating too about the way that Confronting CERA Week has been built out too, in terms of giving folks that basis for shared analysis and shared understanding through some of these relationship building and really political education spaces that are also taking place. And just thinking about, like you were mentioning too, Jon, how we can continue to, especially during, events like CERA Week, where folks are coming in from all across the country, right? Coming together, how can we stand in solidarity, right, with frontline communities in the Gulf South, in other areas who are being directly impacted, without also parachuting in, right, and making sure that we are, aligning ourselves with capacity building and strengthening each other's work in a way that feels supportive instead of transactional. So just really resonating with a lot of that. And I think, jumping off of that too, I know you all talked a lot about kind of what we see happen when we do stay siloed, right? When organizers are in New Mexico fighting, one project while others are fighting another. And similarly across generations, when we have movement elders with a lot of wisdom and time to share. And also young people are feeling urgency in other areas. And when we work in these silos, and I think we've talked a lot about who benefits from that kind of isolation. But I think one thing I'm curious about is also these systems of harm that we've talked about in terms of, right, things like imperialism and extraction and colonialism and white supremacy, all of these overarching systems that are really binding our struggles together, not just across generations and borders, right, but also across movements. And so I'm curious for you all how you see these different struggles and fights, like the ones around migration and criminalization and labor organizing, right, intersecting with all of the work that you all are doing on the ground.
Yes. Thank you. The climate crisis does not exist in isolation. It is part of the same systems of imperialism, extraction, colonialism, and white supremacy that bind our struggles together across movements and borders, man-made borders. When you look at how these systems play out, you see extractivism in our own communities within this empire, causing poverty, health problems, water shortages, air pollution, and climate change that destroys traditional ways of life and agriculture. But this isn't only happening inside our man-made colonial borders. If you look at the history of the Mexican Revolutionary War, you will see that Mexico took down its own fascist government because the dictator was selling out his people to American capitalists. At the time, Americans owned massive amounts of land in Mexico, driving up the cost of living so high that people could barely survive. Does that theme not sound familiar to what we're experiencing right now in the United States? Fast forward, and you see the American empire meddling in foreign countries to destabilize regions, fueling criminal groups so it can get away with extractivism, um, all to strengthen the dollar and Wall Street shareholder portfolios. May I say, while the United States is so concerned about migration coming in and securing the borders, what about the guns flowing across the borders that support these criminal groups in places in Latin America? When this happens, communities are displaced by crime that is fueled by the filthy rich, supporting regime changes like we see right now in Iran or Venezuela, or their lands are poisoned by industry. Their water runs out, and migration becomes a matter of survival. And so these folks from the so-called global South know the colonial empire is the root of the problem and that the empire stands to benefit the most from their suffering. That's why there's so much stigma around migration in United States because the filthy rich don't want these communities crossing the border to share a narrative that exposes how the US dollar is responsible for their displacement and the lives lost back home. For example, there are people in Mexico across the border in Ciudad Juarez, across from El Paso that want to come to CERA Week and they have the legal documentation, they have a tourist visa. But the real barrier isn't legal status, it is the fear of a modern day fascist government exploiting the 14th Amendment, which allows private prisons to enslave people for free labor. ICE acts as the modern day Gestapo, feeding that pipeline to prison labor. So the filthy rich, including those at Blackstone who have investment, or is BlackRock or one of those, that have investments in Geo Group and Core Civic, who are getting rich by imprisoning people from the global south and silencing their voices, silencing the stories on how the United States dollar destroyed their communities, leading them to migrate here. That is why Mexican tourists are afraid to come to CERA Week, because they risk being abducted by ICE for private prison profit. So when you ask how global struggles like those around migration and criminalization and labor, they intersect with our work, the answer is clear. They are the same fight. The same forces displacing people abroad are poisoning our air and water here at home. And the same system that profits from prison labor is the one fueling climate collapse. So like Armand has been preaching and preaching, our resistance has to be just as connected as the oppression that we're up against.
Yeah. Yeah. John, I think you forgot to drop the mic. I mean, gosh, I first kind of started really in this space of activism, specifically on the climate crisis. Like as a scientist, the numbers are a lot alarming. Oh my God. But yeah, like doing more of that work and not being afraid of expanding my knowledge, the climate crisis, we come to understand it's not just about carbon, right? It's about power. When you zoom out, as the Zan reminded us to do earlier, when you zoom out, as you mentioned, Zoe, like you see the imperialism, you see the extraction, you see the colonialism, you see the gross white supremacy. They're not just side issues, they are the operating system of fossil economy, of fossil fuel imperialism. John mentioned, migration, climate collapse literally displaces people. It's drought, it's crop failure, it's flooding. These are not abstract projections where I'm from, where John is from. They are lived realities also across Latin America, the Caribbean, the Gulf South. And yet, instead of addressing those root causes, extraction, land theft, destabilization, governments do what? They respond with militarized borders and criminalization. So the system that extracts from land creates displacement and then punishes the displaced. My family history includes migration. It includes survival and adaptation. I can't separate climate from borders because borders are often the response to climate injustice. Labor has to be a part of these conversations too. As much as some liberals don't want to admit it, or environmentalists don't want to admit it, refinery workers, dock workers, pipeline crews, they are often working class people whose livelihoods, I mean, they've been brainwashed, but their livelihoods have been all structured around an extractive economy. If we talk about shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure without talking about a just transition, like a real just transition outside of liberal spaces, without talking about union protection, without talking about economic restructuring, we leave a lot of working class people exposed. That creates division that corporations will inevitably exploit. Criminalization also shows up in environmental organizing. Surveillance technologies powered by fossil fuel data centers are used to monitor activists and migrants. Probably this episode, protest is policed. Communities defending land are labeled as extremists. Zan, I think you might appreciate this. From an eco-socialist lens, these aren't separate crises. They are interconnected expressions of an economic model that prioritizes profit and control over life. And from an indigenous governance perspective, land as we know it is not property, it is relationship. It is relationship from African spirituality, ancestry, community survival is collective, not individual. So when those worldviews are pushed aside for extraction, you get displacement, you get policing and labor exploitation at the hands of white supremacy, et cetera. And in my work in the Gulf Coast, see it very clearly. Petrochemical expansion requires cheap labor, weak regulation, and communities with limited political power. That pattern repeats globally. So when we talk about climate justice, we have to talk about migrant justice. When we talk about decarbonization, we have to talk about labor rights. When we talk about extraction, we have to talk about criminalization because the system is integrated as such. And if we don't organize across those intersections, we're only treating the symptoms. The work is to build movements that understand that liberation is indivisible across borders, across sectors, across identities. Otherwise, we're fighting the fragments of this gigantic machine.
Yeah, no, I do really appreciate that, Armon. You're right. And like, really just, and I really appreciate this whole, episode, like just how y'all have talked about how our systems like are interconnected and how wealthy CEOs are coordinating across, industries to create sustaining structures and complexes to generate wealth and capital at the expense of our communities, water and land, and also like really echoing what you were saying, John, about specifically the use of prison slave labor, and that really being the driving force behind so many decisions in our society, just period, and especially with policy having to do with migration, but also with the criminalization of drugs and the criminalization of anything, period. Our entire like prison industrial complex is just built around creating more and more slave labor in prison. And, what we're seeing with ICE and what we're seeing with, immigration, as well as how many, continued CIA destabilizations of nations abroad, especially in the global south. It's also an effort to create more cheap labor here in America. When we see how we get involved with I'm like losing my train of thought, but just in general, like with immigration rights and policy, we are always just looking for cheaper labor, and we use it to divide our people and divide, especially the working class, to feel like we're against each other, to feel like we're in separate movements, to feel as if people are quote unquote taking our jobs when, the only thing really taking jobs at this point is, capitalism and AI. So kind of want to bring back to what you had talked about a few questions ago, Armon, about, when you explained how we can coordinate intentionally with our communities, and across our communities and across our movements, and especially with something, thinking of like things like the Rainbow Coalition or different coalitions that we reflect upon. And I'd like to do a little imagination for a sec and ask just like, how do you see, or like what changes, when we do organize like this and when we do coordinate and we work together, like how does that end up looking?
Yeah, gosh. Then thank you. I can't help but like also think about, the piece where you're talking about we are like being forced or not forced, people are being brainwashed to think that the problem is each other. That is like the intersection for me around racial capitalism, where Cedric Johns Robinson, who was like the first person to really write about racial capitalism, maybe really coined the term back in his book around Black Marxism in 1980 something, like 83 or 89. Nevertheless, racial capitalism, as it relates to Robinson or Karen or Barbara Fields, two sisters who also helped write about and conceptualize this a little bit more, it comes down to like racism. We know that the colonizers, that the capitalists enforce racism to keep us in line, essentially, to keep us, as often sometimes people refer to this like analogy of crabs in a bucket. If you've ever seen crabs try to get out of a bucket, they're pulling each other down. So racism reinforces like this network, this dynamic. And so like, as we are addressing the fossil fuel system, fossil fuel imperialism, we're becoming anti-capitalists. And we can't be anti-capitalist without also being anti-racist, because race plays such a big role in the perpetuation of capitalism. Anyways, you specifically asked, what change would there be if our communities and our movements and our generations were able to coordinate? I guess you could also say like as intentionally as corporations or polluters do. I would say if we coordinated it as intentionally as they do, which it's gross thinking like we're taking notes from them, but in this particular practice, the balance of power would shift, right? Like right now, corporations, they share their data, they share legal strategy, they share messaging, they share lobbying plans and capital flows across regions. They move money almost like seamlessly. They plan decades ahead. They coordinate across supply chains from extraction to export. Imagine in your practice, Zan, if our movements did the same in our own way. If organizers in the Permian Basin, in the Gulf South or Appalachia and the borderlands were not just aware of each other's fights, but were like actively aligning strategy, actively sharing our research, our legal tactics, our political education, our rapid response infrastructure, our mutual aid infrastructure, we would stop reacting project by project and legitimately start disrupting this system. It would change the scale. Instead of fighting desal here and just LNG there and data centers over somewhere else, we would be naming and targeting the shared financial institutions, the same regulatory loopholes, the same political donors. We would be able to apply pressure at all of those multiple pressure points simultaneously. Intergenerationally, it would also change like our durability. We know that folks like us bring a sense of urgency, bring creativity and a willingness to challenge like just norms. Elders, as John and I mentioned earlier, they bring memory and strategy and wisdom and hard-learned and hard-earned lessons about what works and what doesn't. When those forces are aligned instead of isolated, siloed, separated, I feel like our movements will stop repeating mistakes and we start to compound wisdom. From my science background, I know that coordination changes outcomes, whether it's in the lab or whether it's in the ecosystem. In ecology, systems are strongest when networks are interconnected. Fragmented systems collapse more easily. The same is true socially. From Black liberation framework, intentional coordination is political education plus material support. It's not just solidarity statements. We see those everywhere. And they have a purpose. No disrespect. Please don't come for me. It's shared infrastructure, though, right? It's aligned campaigns. It's building institutions that can withstand repression or pressure. If we coordinated like corporations do, but of course, rooted in justice, our things, right? Justice instead of profit, we wouldn't just slow down the harm. I feel like we would legitimately build all alternatives at a massive scale across our regions. I think like the last thing that I would say is we would be, if we did this effectively, I challenge us all, even if you're just listening now, I would challenge us all. If we would be able to fight extraction and build just transitions at the same time. And perhaps I would say, even like most importantly, people would feel less alone. Movements would feel less episodic or less episodic and more continuous. Instead of a protest here and a crisis there, we would have a sustained regional strategy for liberation. That's when power becomes real, not symbolic, not just reactive, but organized, durable, transformative, intergenerational, multicultural, multiracial. That is how we combat things like racial capitalism. That's how we combat things like the fossil fuel imperialism.
I think Armand gave a great example of what would change, if we could coordinate like corporations do. Um, I'll just say what happens when we stay siloed. Um, you know, when let's do an example, something we're seeing right now. When organizers in northern New Mexico are fighting Project Jupiter without actually setting foot in our impacted communities, we're all missing the bigger picture, and the isolation will only serve those in power. I just came back from a meeting in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. It was a binational meeting with it was 93rd meeting, joint commission meeting on air quality between the US and Mexico. And um at public comment, I went ahead and named New Mexico Environmental Department and Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TZEQ. They didn't even show up. They zoomed in. They didn't bother come in person like the rest of us. And that seems to be a big issue, not just with the industrialized government folks, the decision makers, but also NGOs. And if we don't work together, Project Jupiter is anticipated to use approximately more energy than all homes in New Mexico. And at the same time, the chance of a lithium shortage in the near future is very significant. If lithium demand from data centers and energy storage containers um, continue to surge ahead of lithium supply. And right now, what we're hearing from the front line is that organizers in northern New Mexico are pushing for Project Jupiter to be solar powered instead of relying on toxic gas turbines. Well, that's great, but we assume that this push is coming from agendas from certain funders that seek to boost industry solar revenues. That's just our assumption. But the issue is that this narrow focus not only leaves out the water consumption issue in our impacted community, because the water flows downward. Santa Fe and Albuquerque, they get first dibs on that water from the Rio Grande. But for us, we have a more southern aquifer, and there's about 1,255 miles between the U.S. the Texas Mexican border that also would like to drink water. Folks down south near the actual Gulf that intersects the river on both sides, they've been in severe droughts. So, but here's another issue when you don't communicate with impacted community. not just the water consumption issue, it's going to make Mexico the next prime target of this militant extractive government, this empire. As we just saw the United States invade Venezuela. They just invaded Venezuela for oil. The Trump administration has been making threats to invade Mexico for over a year, framing that the Sinaloa cartel is a primary national security threat, even though Mexico disagrees, pointing fingers at the Jalisco cartel as the greater danger. And the recent events in Jalisco that's been all over the news prove that Mexico's claim is true. But the reason that we believe this fascist government is already crafting a narrative against Mexico, using the Sinaloa cartel as a scapegoat, as an excuse to violate Mexican sovereignty, because Mexico recently nationalized its lithium mines, just like Venezuela nationalized its oil. And we saw what happened to Venezuela when they nationalized their oil. They had an invasion and they overthrew their president. And the Sinaloa cartels that the U.S. argues as the greater threat in Mexico, because the U.S. thinks it knows what's best for Mexico. Well, they just so happen to have control of the lithium mines at the border state of Sonora, where Mexico's largest lithium deposits are located. That Sonora, that state also borders New Mexico and Arizona. So if we keep operating in silos, northern New Mexico will keep pushing for solar in Santa Fe at the Roundhouse as the false solution to these data center problems. And that false solution will only empower the United States to violate Mexican sovereignty through what Trump is calling an invasion. So think about that the next time you buy produce at the grocery store and you see product of Mexico, or the next time you need to buy replacement car parts for your broken down vehicle, since a large percent of car parts come from Mexico. And if folks would be coming to the borderlands and communicating instead of going straight to the roundhouse with proposals for legislation, we could be having these conversations and be on a mutual understanding.
I really appreciate this this response, especially you, John, bringing in the perspective of how it is, how imperialism is really connected inside and outside, and how we do need to understand how the things that are happening within our country and the way that capitalism operates here is directly built off of the way it extracts and destroys liberation movements abroad, and how it really puts people down even more. And it also I just saw a quote that I really just wanted to shout out real quick before we move on to the next part, but it's from Amilcar Cabral. And he says, "I should just like to make one last point about solidarity between the international working class movements and our national liberation struggle. There are two alternatives. Either we admit that there really is a struggle against imperialism which interests everybody, or we deny it. If, as would seem from all evidence, imperialism exists and is trying simultaneously to dominate the working class in all the advanced countries and smother the national liberation movements in all the underdeveloped countries, then there is only one enemy against whom we are fighting. And if we are fighting together, then I think the main aspect of our of our solidarity is extremely simple. It is to fight." And I just wanted to shout that out, because I really appreciate bringing in the international perspective.
No, thank you so much.
And I just want to shout out to YUCCA for being present at that protest today, at the binational meeting in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Y'all are such appreciated for being part of the community, that's really telling.
No, thank you for that, John. I think that with all of this, we see how deeply embedded, interconnected, and powerful all of these different systems are, and that these systems are built to make us feel ignored, alone, stuck, overwhelmed, and it's really not easy to live in a system that's not built for us. So If there's someone that's listening to this episode that feels overwhelmed with everything that they're seeing and doesn't know what to do or how to get out of it in this climate, what do you think you would say to them?
Yeah, oh God, I think this is incredibly important question for our generation. I would say like, well, for me, if this offers an example, I always try to think of uh, things that are grounding. Like in my office, I have a picture of my family on my desk. This is what grounds me. I do it for my mom. I mean, it's, I have a hard time picking it up, but it's for my mom and my grandmother and my sister. But I would say, like, more specifically, if you feel overwhelmed, that makes sense. Let's be real. It makes sense. And and also you're not weak for feeling that. You're actually perceiving reality clearly. These systems are interconnected. They are powerful. They were designed to be durable and self-protecting. But here's the part that I think often gets left out. They're also incredibly fragile. From like from a scientific perspective, I know that complex systems that rely specifically on constant extraction or constant growth and constant control are inherently unstable. They might appear or look permanent until they aren't. And also history backs that up as well. We know through Black liberation that every empire that once felt untouchable eventually cracked because ordinary people organized way beyond the fear that they tried to instill. The Black Panther Party was surveilled. They, oh God, they were infiltrated, and even of course, well, of course, they were attacked because they built programs that met people's material needs and shifted political consciousness way beyond people imagined. Power reacts when it feels threatened, and our human our human feelings of overwhelm is often the result of like trying to hold on to the whole system alone in your head. But that's not that's not the way it should be. None of us are meant to fight this entire system by ourselves. So like we all have to find our entry point, and maybe that is desalination in your city or private equity in your in where you live. Maybe it's microjustice. Maybe it's labor organizing. Maybe it's art bills. Maybe that's research. Maybe that's cooking food for a meeting. I think like every movement, as history shows, needs ecosystems of roles. And I think the deeper truth is also that corporations coordinate because they are afraid of what happens when we do it. They wouldn't spend, billions of dollars on lobbying, surveillance, and public relations PR if they weren't worried about organized people. They understand collective power. We just have to remember that we have it too. I I was taught that struggle is part of life, but the reality also is so is community. So if you're overwhelmed, don't retreat. Connect with someone, to connect with people, find people, study, build your political education, rest, of course, when you need to, but most importantly, come back. Remind yourself that movements are marathons, not sprints. The system is big, but when we are gathered together, like I'll never forget the feeling of walking to or marching to the roundhouse in Santa Fe with this large crowd of people during the We Got Us mass mobilization. And I'm looking around at all these incredible folks. And then I see Zoe's face. Like we are meant to connect to folks. We are meant to see the future in each other and remind us that it is our collective future we are fighting for. So yeah, the system is big, but so are we. And history has never been changed by isolated individuals. It is always always been changed by coordinated people who have simply decided that what feels impossible, what felt impossible, was still worth fighting for.
You know, it's so easy to get burnt out. It really is, especially in this day of age. When I was a kid, we had slow dial-up and we weren't as connected and weren't as aware as what was going on in the world because the internet was so damn slow. And so I spent a lot of time outside helping my grandmother garden. And now, I have a lot of compassion and concern for younger folks who grew up with social media and only knowing the chaos of everything what's wrong with the world. It's just in your face on your screens on in bed, with you when you wake up before you go to bed. And it's very important to take care of yourself first. It's not selfish to be in an airplane and put on your own oxygen mask first before helping others. That translates to self-care is not selfish. And as Armand was saying, humans need community, and this system is designed to where we all live separately in cookie cutter houses in suburban neighborhoods, living in bubbles. And even if we live in urban zones, they're still divided by race. And so my recommendation is get involved with a community organization. Find an organization that aligns with you, whether it be about the environment, whether it be about LGBTQ rights, whatever your passion is, find an organization that aligns with it. Go interact with others because we as humans depend on community. It's a basic human need, just like food, air, and water. We cannot live in confinement and live alone. And like Armand said about grounding yourself, find an activity that is grounding for you, a centered activity or hobby where you can just disconnect from it all. You can find a way, you see my plants that I have back here behind me, and I'm just going to show you guys. For example, I don't have land where I can garden because I live in an urbanized concrete jungle apartment community, but I'll show you how I adapted and I disconnect. These are my succulents, and I just took some dirt and stuck in the holes of this terracotta here. And this is what connects me and grounds me to Mother Earth, who reminds me who I'm defending every time. Like, look, these flowers are blooming and they're gorgeous and they smell like cloves. I wish you guys could smell them. But this is what reminds me who I'm defending, every time these flowers bloom. So this is the way I ground myself and disconnect from the chaos in the world. So find something like that you can just ground yourself and to help you stay sane because this is a lot more fun than being in the psych hospital, coloring those coloring books. So yeah.
Totally. I just want to echo what you said about self-care and how that is so essential. And, all of us want to be taking care of the people that we love and care about, but that's not always feasible or reasonable. So it's really important that we, take up that responsibility of taking care of ourselves and making sure that we're able to show up in spaces because, when we burn out, we can't be there for our community. And that goes back and forth for taking care of your community. Like, you can't take care of your community if you can't take care of yourself. Like, it's a hard cycle, but and that's part of the intentionality of what we're opposing right now and getting to a place where wellness is actually taken into account in all aspects. Thank you so much for your words.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you both again. I think that I don't know, that piece made me think a lot about how a lot of times we think of self-care and community care, right, as two very separate, again, siloed things, when in reality, because we need to depend on each other and we need to build connections and relationships with each other and we need to be in solidarity with each other, like, how are those things one and the same, right? And I think that, in terms of what you were mentioning, Armon, around, folks getting plugged in to the movement ecosystem, kind of in all of these different places and all of these different ways that folks can get plugged into the work. I'm curious, as we're like closing out this episode for today, for you all specifically, are there ways that, I know we talked a little bit about CERA Week specifically, but also as we think in like the months ahead and beyond CERA Week too, how folks can plug into the work that you all are doing specifically, and maybe any like final closing thoughts you all want to share as well.
Yeah, this is great. I'll keep it really brief. I mean, you are more than welcome to reach out to myself out here in the Gulf South, on the lands of Lipan Apache, the Carrizo, Comecrudo, and Carancua. And if you want to find some time to chat and get some plugged in, or just want to go through some like political education, my door is always open. I organize every day through our local chapter of Democratic Socialists of America here in Corpus Christi. I'm the co-founder of an organization called the Gulf of Mexico Youth Climate Summit. I organize with the Permian to Gulf Coast Coalition. I organize with the Gulf South to Appalachia group. And if you're curious about any of those, hit my DMs. I would love to have a conversation about getting plugged in. I would love to have a conversation about how to get some motivation, where to start. Because I started somewhere, Zoe started somewhere, Yaj started somewhere, so did John, so did Tori, so did Zan. Like, we all have to start somewhere. And if it's not starting somewhere, you want to continue it, but you want to strengthen it, like, even better. Let's do it. I can help get you connected either to CERA Week or any of the work that is being done here in the Gulf South. It is just as simple as sending a message.
Your phone is going to blow up. If you're okay with that.
And you know what? Sometimes that's what it takes for us to move the needle.
I would say, I suppose look for the link in the description of the chat, maybe, or not the chat, the description of the does someone want to like finish that for me? I
The
don't know how
pod.
you guys, yeah, I don't know how you guys, I don't know what the description looks like, if you can put links in there or not, but yeah, just look for the link to the RSVP page and join us at the hype call on Thursday, March 5th, 2026 at 6 p.m. Central Time. There should be a link for that too. And yeah, if you can volunteer your time, there's a sign up form for that. And it's my understanding, according to Armand, that the support for travel and lodging deadline for that form has been extended to March 5th as well. So we look forward to seeing you guys throw down in Houston, and I can drive you guys by the location in Houston where we threw down for Standing Rock outside of Energy Transfer Partners headquarters and throw them the bird. Throw whoever you guys want the bird. And um yeah, I have a video of that I'd be happy to share of y'all of how we just transitioned to that protest to now CERA Week we throw down. So happy for y'all to come see my hood where I grew up.
Hell yeah.
Excited to see it.
Yeah, no, we are so excited to be joining y'all in person in just a couple weeks. And like folks have mentioned, would really encourage everyone to jump on to that hype call that's happening later this week. We were on the last one and it was a super fun time. And so looking forward to seeing folks there. I'm curious, like from the YUCCA crew, do folks have any like closing thoughts before we wrap up for today?
Other than just thank y'all, I have always been able to appreciate the amount of intention that you put into all of your like responses and just being able to continuously connect with you and really build our power with each other across states that shouldn't exist. And so, yeah, I just wanted to give some time to appreciate y'all taking the time today. and speaking with us. And excited to see you at CERA Week.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. Just, yeah, thank you all so much for being here. All of this information is so essential and, again, like, needs to be known by as many people as possible. And yeah, it's great that we have this outlet that we can work with you on. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in and listening to our guests today. Please connect with them. Connect with YUCCA, get on the hype call. We also have our We Got Us network meetings on Mondays. We are doing too much all the time, so please just stay connected with us if you're interested in getting a task or two to help us. Like, hit us up.
Yeah, and like folks mentioned too, we'll make sure to link all of the resources that Jon and Armon shared in terms of how to plug into CERA Week organizing in the description, as well as the link to join that We Got Us network meeting that we hold and to get more involved with YUCCA's work. So however you all choose to plug in as we move forward, we're super excited to see you in the work and see you in the fight moving forward.
Yeah, I wanted to say really quickly, thank you so much for allowing the representation of the Gulf South to be represented in y'all spaces. It's such a beautiful testament to your commitment to what solidarity looks like and in real time. And I'm always so thrilled and happy whenever I am able to engage with anyone from the YUCCA family. I have never met individuals who really walk the talk as much as y'all do. So thanks for having me here, and I look forward to throwing it down with y'all really soon.
I completely agree. You know, at Standing Rock, there we learned about this prophecy. I can't remember who it was, if it was Black Elk or someone had. There was a 7 generation prophecy where in 7 generations the children of the indigenous will unite with the children of the colonizers, and yeah, you guys are bringing that unity, and it's very much needed at this time when Mother Earth is she's heating up because she's got a fever. So, and yeah, we are the cause of that fever, and it's the original peoples of this land who are supposed to lead that fight to save Mother Earth. So I appreciate y'all's role in this and fulfilling that prophecy.
No, you all as well. Thank you both again so much for joining us. I think our entire crew is always so grateful anytime we can learn from both of you and just the wealth of knowledge and experiences and wisdom that you all bring to every space that we work in together. So it was so great to have you both on. And yeah, for folks that are tuning in, just be sure to, stay tuned for more action items coming out of CERA Week. I'm sure that folks will be able to follow along on social media as that work continues to move. And just thank you all so much for tuning in with us today. We'll see you next episode.
Up, shut it down. Don't hold on to what is now. Don't fall through, cut it out. Rebel music, bump it now.